And yeah, so this talk is titled The End of the Barrel File and the new modularization techniques with Sheriff. And a quick introduction of myself. So I come from Austria. I'm part of Angular Architects. And so I'm usually doing consulting, trainings, workshops, and that stuff. So I hope, or at least the plan was to keep the talk very short. So yesterday it was 20 minutes. Usually the real talks takes it a little bit longer than when I practice it. But we have three main points. The first one is kind of an explanation of what actually module boundaries, what they are, how we use them, and what we want to have from them. Then the issue that we have when we use barrel files for modules, and what consequence or what impact they have on the tree shaking part. And then this tool that comes from us, the Sheriff tool, which allows us to still have modules with the same features, but without the barrel file, so to say. So when it comes to modularity, we usually say, what's a module? And if I say, if I talk about a module, then I usually don't mean the NG module. I mean just a module, how we kind of see it in a general sense. I would say a module is a group of files belonging together, logical group. And I have two requirements that I want to have from a module. I want to have the possibility of encapsulation. So I want to be able to say there are some certain files which are not accessible from the outside, so hidden files. And I also want to have the possibility to come up with dependency rules. So I want to be able to say, although these are two modules, although these files are actually exposed to the public, module A is still not allowed to access module B because I want to forbid it. These are the two requirements that I have. And this is not something really new. With NX, we have already been able to do this for a very long time. Sheriff is a very young tool, but both at the moment can fulfill these kind of requirements. A little bit about architecture, I'll keep it short, but generally speaking, we always need to come up with isolated modules. So this approach that I have here is this approach with domain-driven design. You can also say you want to use something else like scopes, or you can isolate your modules in any way. The most important part that your modules are isolated. So this is the main thing. And what you see here is this two-layer approach, where we would say we split our applications up into multiple domains. So we have those kind of domain module groups. And at the very bottom, we also have some kind of shared modules, which we have to reuse for different purposes. So this could be some utility functions or something else. And within a domain, we usually have then the actual modules. So every domain, depending on the approach that you take, but in this case, I try to split my components into those smart and dumb components, and I'll put them into their own module. So I say the smart components, they go into the feature module. The UI components or dumb components, they go into the UI module. And then what I always use is some kind of state management, or I have some services which can communicate with the backend, which might also include a little bit of logic. And I put them into a separate module, which I call data. And then there is this relationship between these module types, where I want to say, well, the smart components, the feature module, that can access any module in this domain as long as it is part of the same domain. And for data and for UI, it's a little bit different. UI and data can access only the model, so that we have the same input, so that we have the same interfaces, but they are not allowed to access each other. So everything needs to go via the smart components. And if a UI component by mistake would try to inject a service or would use something from the data or even from the feature modules, then I would expect an error in some way. Good. And this is what I quickly want to showcase. So I have here one application which does this already. So as I said before, the most popular tool in Angular that we use for module dependencies is NX, but there's also the one from us. For obvious reason, I'm showing ours, where I think the configuration is a little bit better. And it's also then easier to come up with those modules. So this is this Sheriff that we see here. When you use Sheriff, you can have a normal layout of your application code. You see here, this is all done a little bit structures. You see here customers, holidays, and shared. So customers and holidays, that represents my domains. Shared is then shared. And inside of my domains, I have then my actual modules. It's just normal folders. And there is then a configuration where I can now, of course, define that these folders are now modules. Again, different approaches, Sheriff and NX. But in the end, I always have here some kind of an index.ts, and that's this barrel file. And in this barrel file, I can define those elements which I want to expose. So I say here, for example, this feature main exposes these 5 files. And for example, if I then go to data, then I see that this data actually exposes only provide customers data from customers actions. But at the same time, we see that there is here, for example, also a customer effects file, which is not exposed, and therefore it cannot be used by any other module. So if I would now go into my feature main, and if I would now say, for some reason, my feature module wants to use this customer effects, which is forbidden, so I just go to import it here. Then we have here the import, also need to save it, and then we are getting here an ESLint error, telling us this is forbidden, this is a deep import into a barrel file or into a module, and the only way how I can import something from the data module is that I need to go to index.ts. There is no other option, and hence I cannot use the customer effects in this case. So this is this module encapsulation, really getting errors if I'm using files which are not exposed. And the other thing are then the dependency roles. So I have here a Sheriff configuration. This is this configuration file where I have dependency roles. And there I say, based on certain tags that I have assigned before my modules, I can say here, well, everything which is a feature module can access type model, type UI, type data, as I've shown it before in the slide. And I also say here type UI can only access model and type data can also only access model. Which means if I'm now in a UI module and I want to access something from data, even if it is exposed, I'm still not allowed to do it. Yeah? So if I go back and if I would say here, okay, data module, it exposes the from customers, for example, that's public. But I then go into my UI module, and some component there says I want to use now this from customers, so, like this. Then we see we're getting here another error message telling us you have now a violation of the dependency modules, of the dependency rules. It's not the issue with the module encapsulation, it's because you violated the dependency rules. You are not allowed to use something from data if you are of type UI. This is what this error message here is telling me. And the way how we do this, again, so the way how we define modules and set up especially module encapsulation always goes via the barrel file. That's the same that NX is doing and the same that we do also with Sheriff. What NX has in addition, I mean, I also have here the NX version, but it's the same thing more or less. NX requires you to have a library for every module. So in NX, it's not a folder, it has to be a library. That's when you have, for example, here the same application in NX, and I would open here the data, then you see it comes already with these library necessary files with source, lib, and all that stuff. But in the end, it's the same thing. I have my barrel file, I have the module encapsulation, and also the dependency rules. So that's the basic way of modularization in Angular, how we do it these days. So far, so good? Oh, okay, good. So, and now there is a problem with those barrel files. A problem which we have actually been made aware of a year ago when we presented Sheriff for the first time at NG Poland. From Wojtek Maszek, I think that's his last name, he told us, look, there is some issues if you use index.ts. The more index.ts files, the more barrel files you have in an application, the harder it becomes for tree shaking. Tree shaking means that I have some mechanism that takes my JavaScript files, and this is a process that finds out those things that I'm not using, and those things then also don't end up in the final bundle size. So it's really about reducing the bundle size, that when a user opens the browser, that only those things are downloaded that they really need. That's the main thing. And barrelfile is really a problem for tree shaking. So I have here, let's say this is the worst case that could happen. I have here the normal and normal Angular application on the right side. In blue color, I have a lazy loaded module. It could be something with defer, a component, or a router configuration, but something which I don't want to have in my main bundle, lazy loaded. Both have a dependency to the same module, and this module is protected by this barrel file. But you see that my application actually has a dependency to the smaller one, to the green one. This is not so large. But my lazy loaded has a dependency to the larger one, where I would now naturally say it's not a problem as long as the large one, the blue one, does not end up in the application bundle. Then this is really a problem. Now what we then usually have is that the bundler comes along. There are different bundlers, ESBuild, Rollup, or Webpack. It's not an Angular specific problem, it's a problem that we have in JavaScript everywhere. And the bundler then goes to the application. And the way how a bundler works, they are following all these import paths. So they are kind of then including all those files. And then at some point it reaches the barrel file, because this is the entry point. And for obvious reasons, the barrel file now is exporting a lot of other things that my application actually does not need. And now there is a problem with tree shaking, because the tree shaking has now really an issue. It doesn't really know. I mean, it knows that the application requires only the green one, but we cannot really be sure if the blue one is also not necessary. Maybe there is an internal dependency between green and blue. Maybe there is certain code that is triggered by blue, which also the green one requires, or some other reasons. But in the end, what we always have with this tree shaking mechanism, that it is not really that it cannot run in an optimized way. And the bundle, of course, it has to play it safe. So it cannot make the mistake and miss some things. So when it wants to play safe, it includes the actual dependency, but also the larger one, because both are included in the bundle file. And then we have the issue that we end up with a main TS with things that we don't need. And if they're large, then we have a real problem. So that's the issue. The solution, of course, would not be that we say, well, then let's just drop this barrel file. Let's just have a module without the barrel file. And the application and the lazy loaded chunks, they should just do a deep import. They should just directly get those files that they actually need. But of course, that's not going to happen, because we still need this index.ts to define the module encapsulation. Again, module dependency rules wouldn't be that much of a problem, because I know that this is a module, and then I can say, yeah, you can fetch the file, because it's not important if you are accessing a private or a public. It's more important if you are actually allowed to access this module. That's not the problem. The problem is always this exposing or the encapsulation. And I have an example to prove this problem. So this is here my holidays application that I use all the time. And there is a certain feature. So I click here on holidays, and there is an edit button. And if I click on that edit button, then Quill starts up. This is an editor which is very powerful. Obviously, it's also very large in size. And in the implementation at the moment, this editor is not part of my application, but let me quickly open it. That's the holiday card component. I have here a defer. So this app Quill application with the huge dependency is actually now this lazy loaded thing that I don't want to have in my main bundle. And this app Quill, if I go to my TypeScript file, we see that it's coming from shared form. So I have created my own form module, my shared form module, where I say this is now the place where I put all these things that I need for form management, whatever that is. And if we open it, Then we see here form. We have here our index.ts. So the index.ts, yes, yeah, the quill component is available. Select options, form errors component as well. And so that's more or less than my shared module. Now the problem is, that's not my holiday card component is not the only component that has an access to this shared module. Obviously makes sense, that's why I have shared modules, that many modules can access them. The form errors component is something I use for NG modules to show an error message. And as you see here, that one is then also used by the newsletter component. That one also requires, also has a dependency there. And the problem in this case is that this newsletter component is part of the application. It's part of the main bundle. I don't want to load it separately or as a chunk. So if with this information, so one huge module with forms, one dependency coming from the application, one dependency coming from the first, so I'm from a lazy loaded element, as I've shown it before in the slides. And if I now run here the build, takes some time. It's quite huge, but this is important. This number here, initial chunk files, it's 1.3 megabytes. So you need to remember this number, 1.3. The thing now is, as I said it before, if I would now skip the barrel file and if I would now directly go to the form groups component and directly to the quill component, the tree shaking can be done much, much better. It's still the same application, just the import path changes. So if I say here I have my form errors component and I then import it not from the index.ts, from the barrel file, but I just import the file directly, we see already now Sheriff starts to cry out. It says, hey, this is not important. This is a barrel module, so you really need to go to the index.ts. But the nice thing is I can still run the npm build because TypeScript doesn't care about ESLint errors. And then I can also go to my holiday card component, and there I can do the same thing. So I can say, okay, I now want to access this quill component, yes. So both dependencies, application and lazy chunk, are now directly accessing those files. So I didn't change anything in terms of functionality, it's still the same, but the tree shaking process can now be optimized. Because now if I now rerun build, then we will see that we shrink down to 1.8 megabyte. And you also see here that this quill component ended up now as a lazy loaded chunk, so to say. So it's not part of the main bundle. And again, the only change was that I have now avoided this barrel file. Now tree shaking was really optimized. But there is still now this problem with my modules. I have now lost all the possibility to come up with module encapsulation. I can now import anything. And here we have an advantage with Sheriff that it is not bound to a library. So an NPM library always requires an index.ts. There's a package JSON, you can use secondary entry points. That's a topic I want to mention at the end. But with Sheriff, we only have the index.ts for the module. There is nothing else that demands it. And what we can do now, I need to check if they have a separate slide for it. Yeah. So no encapsulation without barrels. And what the Sheriff has now is this barreless mode. So I can now have modules without barrel files, but still have something like an encapsulation. And the way how that works, everything is already configured. I need to go to my Sheriff config. I need to make sure that enable barreless file is enabled. It's a mixture, so I can still have my index.ts modules, but I can also use the barreless. And now what we are doing is that instead, this is something, a naming convention that we had to come up with. You see it here already. There should be a folder which has a certain name, and that's the default setting. You can change the setting, but by default, the internal folder of a module is now defining what should be encapsulated. Which means I can now get rid of the index.ts. I don't need that anymore, because now I'm defining my encapsulation via this folder. And for example, I can now, for example, go quickly back to the holiday card component, because there all of a sudden, the import is now working. Because now Sheriff has detected that this is now a module which doesn't have a barrel file, the index.ts is not there, so it has marked it automatically as a barreless file. And now it is tracking the internal folder. And if I would now say, I want to move my quill counter service, because this is an internal service for the quill component, no one else should use that. Now I say that's actually hidden, and I can move it here. And this is also a nice side effect of not having a barrel file. A refactoring is extremely simple. I just need to remove it, I just move files around. I can also move it to other modules. If the IDE is a good one, it will automatically update all the imports. So we see this here from the quill component, for example. It has already seen that now this quill counter service comes from internal. But if I now say in my app holiday card, I want to inject this quill counter service. So inject quill counter, like this. Then we have now an error message. And now it doesn't tell us this is a barrel file, but now it says this cannot be imported because it is encapsulated. You are not allowed to do this anymore. And if I say now, okay, that's good, but I don't want to name this one internal, I want to use another name, then it's not a problem. Now I just need to go here to the Sheriff configuration. There are of course default settings, and the name now could not be private or underscore, whatever you want. Now it's called private. So if I would now go here to import, it says your internal is not the encapsulation folder, so you are happy to use the quill counter from there. But if I now say, okay, well, this is actually private, that's now the new name, and I take now this quill counter service and move it to private, the imports are automatically updated, but we have here the error message, again the same thing, telling us this is an encapsulated file, this does not work. So this has many advantages. You've seen the barrel size has really shrunk down. It's also easier to kind of do this refactoring, reassign files to other modules, define the encapsulation. What others have told us, they like it if you open here this directory and then you immediately see what is actually exposed. The internal or private in this case here is exposed. So it has also some other advantage, not just the shrinking of the barrel file. Or of the module, obviously. Yeah. That was it already, more or less. And there are a few things I want to say about the so-called hybrid mode, because quite a lot of are also using NX. And if you use NX, you will definitely have some libraries. So libraries will come with an index.ts. That's just the way how it is. So what you can do in Sheriff is you can, as I said already before, you could now say you have your NX libraries, but the NX library is not really now a module on its own, but within NX libraries you have multiple folders, and they are the modules where you can then come up with your dependency rules and the encapsulation. The question is what defines then a library? And there you could then say, okay, a library for me is more or less a group that makes sense to be cached as a unit, or some other features that NX has built in. So NX is not just about module boundaries. It has to offer much more, like caching of build caches and that stuff. And then you can say, okay, modules are directories, they are covered by Sheriff, this whole modularity stuff, but when it comes to caching, I still use the NX libraries. And in order to still have these dependency rules with NX libraries as well, you can mix both things together. So I can very easily just add an index.ts, then it's a barrel module, and if I remove it, then it's just a barreless module. Dependency rules, encapsulation, then of course needs to be adapted. That's not the issue. And one last thing, if you now say you have a library, because it has to be a library, like this form shared, because you need to reuse it for multiple applications, and not just within a monorepository, but you really have to deploy it somewhere, then of course you don't need to use, or you shouldn't use this Sheriff barreless mode. But for those really libraries in that sense, as we understand it, third-party libraries that are exposed, you just create secondary entry points. So in the end, I would create a secondary entry point for my quill component, and another one for my form groups component, and then all the others would directly go to this mini barrel file, to the secondary entry point, and would only catch then the form group component or the quill component. That also works, but of course you have to do this manually. So you have to set up those secondary entry points. You also have to care about it, that they are in the package JSON and that stuff. So if you don't really require it, then you also have now another option. And an example for secondary entry point is, for example, Angular Material. They have done this. So if you ever have seen an import to Angular Material, it's never at Angular Material. There's always something at the end. And that's not because the complete package has this 3-part name, but these are the secondary entry points that they have. But this is something, secondary entry points, as I said before, is really for third-party libraries. If you're running just a single application, then it's not necessary. Then I would just go with the barreless modules. Good. Are there some questions? Yes?
If I would like to go to the barreless configuration,
yes,
and it's easy, I just need to delete this index.ts file.
Yeah.
But do I have to put this internal folder even if it will be empty? It must be there?
No, you don't need to. If you say you have no internal folder, then this means that everything is exposed. Okay. The modularity. So this is something that used to be the way how you defined modules in the past for Sheriff. Sheriff in the past said a module is not defined by its configuration. Mm-hmm. It's defined by the existence of a barrel file. Everything that has an index.ts is a module. With barreless, this is now going to change, because now any folder which you are matching here with this path matcher becomes now automatically a module. Yeah, and then it doesn't, and then it could have an index.ts, and if it doesn't have, then it's seen as a barreless module, and then it depends, is there an internal folder or something there? This is encapsulated. If not, the dependency rules still apply. And that's also the reason why if some of you have already been using Sheriff, that's why we renamed the tagging property to modules, because this is now the specification, the definition of modules. It's not just tagging of existing modules, it makes modules. That's no different. Other questions?
Yeah, one question from my side. So if you have monorepo from NX and you have many applications and libraries, do you have to configure every library or application separately, or you have one common shared config?
We have one common config. So we have here the full NX version, and here this is really the hardcore stuff, where I said I have the NX libraries. And if you look in the Sheriff config, there we are, then you see here that we have here the tagging. This is still the old one, where we have the libs. So we're directly going to all the libs and then say, well, everything which is there then in index.ts is now a module on its own. And you can then very easily just say, okay, I want to do this for the apps as well. So something like this, and then you're tagging those apps as a module as well. Okay. So Sheriff would then take over the complete dependency rules, not just for the NX libraries, but also for their folder modules. And for obvious reasons, then you might want to disable the NX ESLinting rules, because then you have two things which are doing the same. That doesn't really make sense. What we usually would then recommend, if you have this monorepository approach and you are used to having one library per module, that you do it then like this. You can still have your libs, but then a lib is a complete domain. So this is what we have here. So I have customers, and if I open then customers, then you see that in the customers libs we have our modules again, and these are then the Sheriff modules. But you still have then everything together in an NX library, which means the build cache is applied to the complete customers all the time, where you would say, yeah, this makes sense, because I don't want to have one NX library with 2 files only. That's too much overhead, so you want to put more into it. And this is then here this combination that you have. And the Sheriff config for this approach would then look like this. So you have then here still those libs, where I say, yes, everything that starts with lib source is just an NX lib. So you are just tagging the library itself, which does not have any use. It's just that there is a tag assigned. But then you say everything in libs starting with the first subfolder, source, lib, and then you start with the actual modules, which are the normal folders. Yeah, so this is what we do if you have an NX library, if you have an NX monorepository with libs, that we try to make larger libs, not so tiny ones, and then apply the Sheriff for the modularity.
Okay, so
yeah.
One thing in terms of NX, this barreless config doesn't work.
No. So what you have in NX, because NX has the unit of where NX starts to work more or less is always the library. So the affected, the testing is always the library. And the library requires an index.ts or a public API, what the Angular CLI is doing. So what they would have to do is that they would have to rewrite, I would say, large things of the way how the linter works. There is, though, the possibility for implicit libraries that Unis did. So this is a community plugin, which means you can also mark certain folders as libraries, but you still require the index.ts, because this is what the ESLint rules in NX are looking for. Okay. And he said this is something, a complete rewrite that you would have to do to get rid of this index.ts.
About this folder configuration, you are able only to put the root directory of this library, yeah? You cannot pass anything special, regex or whatever.
Oh, yeah, that's I mean, the release was on Sunday, so I just made sure that the internal and that the renaming works. But in the end, look, it's...
so there was a change in quest.
No, I mean something else. I just want to show you how simple it actually is to implement a regular expression. Encapsulation, not the rules. But you have here not is unresolvable import. Where do I have it? Has encapsulation violations. There is access exposed file for barreless modules, and what this one is doing at the very end, it just says if the possible encapsulated folder path, here we have it, starts with whatever you have set up, yeah, and then I just add the regular expression, and then I also have it.
Yeah, I think it would be cool, because then, I don't know, you can add private suffix to the files.
Yes. Some people said, for example, why can I not mark those files with an underscore? Yeah. Something like this.
Old school JavaScript.
Yeah, whatever you want. If you have a regular expression, you can do whatever you want, so that's not the problem. It's not there yet, but they're not so hard to do. So, further questions?
And having index.ts, you can always import many things from one module, so to say, right? So in this barreless mode, you cannot do this, right? You have always one import per one. You always import one thing from one file.
Yes. So you're always going directly to the file, so you will end up with more lines in the imports, if you mean this. Yeah. No, this is the way how it is. So if I say here holiday card component, you see here the quill component, the quill counter, they are both coming from the same module, but since I'm accessing directly the file, they are from there. Yeah, but I would say yes, that's an IDE issue. They should usually handle those imports for us automatically. Okay? Good. Thank you very much.